Hey everyone, Noah Zerby here. This is one of a series of short videos dealing with concepts in development in the context of global politics. In this video, we're going to consider the process of decolonization and the lasting political legacy that colonization had on the newly independent countries. We look at the economic legacy of colonialism in a separate video. There's a lot to consider, so let's get to it. Now, as we mentioned in other videos, the historical context is important here, and it's impossible to cover all of it in a brief video of this kind. For now, let's just try to remember that the process of decolonization took place roughly in two distinct historical periods. The first corresponds with the decolonization and independence in the Americas in the early 19th century. Between 1806 and 1826, most of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies in the Americas achieved their independence and established self-governance. In Haiti, a slave uprising overthrew French colonial authorities and culminated in Haitian independence in 1806. This marked the beginning of independence movements in the Americas. Elsewhere in the Americas, independence movements managed to secure freedom across Central and South America, such that by the mid-1820s, most of the European colonies in the Americas outside of the British island colonies in the Caribbean were established as independent states. A second round of decolonization, this one concentrated largely in the European colonies in Africa and Asia, took place in the period immediately after World War II. This round of colonization began with India's independence in 1947, which was a remarkable achievement. Remember that India was the proverbial jewel in the crown of the British Empire. Independence for India meant that the end of the British Empire was at hand. Gandhi's campaign for nonviolent resistance had been successful, forcing Britain's hand, and others would soon follow. Ghana gained its independence in 1957, making it the first African colony to gain independence, but many others quickly followed. Indeed, as the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan noted in his speech to the South African Parliament in February 1960, the winds of change are sweeping across the continent, and indeed across the British Empire more broadly. It was a striking speech in part because it's a recognition of the move forward towards independence, but equally so because it was a sharp rebuke of the South African system of apartheid. Let's listen to just a short part of that speech.
In the 20th century, and especially since the end of the war, the processes which gave birth the nation-states of Europe have been repeated all over the world. We have seen the awakening of national consciousness in peoples who have for centuries lived in dependence upon some other power. 15 years ago, this movement spread through Asia. Many countries there of different races and civilizations pressed their claim to an independent national life. Today, the same thing is happening in Africa. And the most striking of all the impressions that I have formed since I left London a month ago is of the strength of this African national consciousness. Different places, it takes different forms, but it is happening everywhere. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact, and we must all accept it as a fact. And our national policies must take account of it.
Those winds of change would eventually sweep not just over the British colonies, but over former French colonies of Vietnam and Algeria, and indeed across most of the rest of the world as well. At the end of World War II, some 750 million people, about one-third of the world's population at the time, lived in colonies. By 1991, fewer than 2 million did. But the colonial era left an indelible mark on the newly independent states, and it's that mark that I want to focus on in the remainder of this video. So let's think about the challenges faced by these new post-colonial states. Take Ghana as an example. On March 6, 1957, Ghana secured its independence from the British Empire, becoming the first former colony in Africa to do so. Britain had controlled the country, which it called the Gold Coast, since 1874. At the time it secured its independence, the country's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, observed, "My first objective is to abolish from Ghana poverty, ignorance, and disease. We shall measure our progress by the improvement in the health of our people, by the number of children in school, and by the quality of their education, by the availability of water and electricity in our towns and villages, and by the happiness which our people take in being able to manage their own affairs. The welfare of our people is our chief pride, and it is by this that the government will be judged." Nkrumah's lofty post-independence goals obscured some real challenges faced by the country. At independence in 1957, Ghana's 6 million people had a life expectancy of just 44 years. The child mortality rate was 273 deaths per 1,000 live births, and its per capita GDP was just $170. Further, the economy was heavily dependent on exports of cocoa, raw chocolate, which accounted for the vast majority of export earnings and whose price would fall by nearly 50% in the 3 years after independence. But even more fundamentally, Ghana, like many post-colonial states, was confronted by both a practical problem of state building and a more existential challenge of nation building. Remember that we've distinguished previously between the state as a political unit of governance and the nation as a group of people with a shared sense of identity. The challenge faced by many countries at independence was that they needed both. They had to both develop the practical institutions of governance and develop the shared sense of belonging that defined the nation. Many of these challenges were exacerbated by colonial policies that reflected a limited understanding of the actual societies they were seeking to govern, as well as premeditated efforts to use internal divisions within the colonies to advance the objectives of colonial rule. Perhaps nowhere is this made clearer than at the Berlin Conference of 1884, where the major European powers sought to divide Africa between them. Lord Salisbury, one of the British negotiators at the time, later observed that we had been engaged in drawing lines upon a map where no white man's foot had ever trod. We had been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never exactly knew where the mountains, rivers, and lakes were. Consequently, the post-colonial boundaries inherited after independence often bore little connection to the lived experience on the ground. Nigeria, for example, was home to more than 250 distinct ethnic groups, speaking an equally diverse number of languages. The three largest groups, the Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, collectively comprised only about 66% of the population. Tensions between the largest ethnic groups are not uncommon, and religious differences plagued the country. And Nigeria is hardly unique in this respect. Nearly every country in Africa is home to a wide range of ethnic groups unified into a single territory. Think of the Hutu and the Tutsi in Rwanda, the Shona and Ndebele in Zimbabwe, the Zulu and Xhosa in South Africa, and so on. In South Asia, the division of India and Pakistan and the ongoing dispute over the Kashmir region stems from British colonial divisions and the artificial and thus disputed nature of post-colonial boundaries. And in the Middle East, contemporary boundaries reflect British and French agreements over how to best divide the region between them, rather than any lived realities on the ground. And so in the post-colonial context, the project of nation building came to be of central importance. Put simply, nation building refers to the process of creating that shared sense of belonging, of establishing that sense of nationhood among the people. While some political leaders would exploit existing divisions to advance their own position, others explicitly sought to transcend the artificial boundaries imposed under colonialism and to develop new political identities. The most salient example of this in the African context were those of Kwame Nkrumah, who we discussed earlier, and Patrice Lumumba, the leader of post-independence Democratic Republic of the Congo. Seeing the problems associated with ethnic divisions and nationalism in the Congo, Lumumba promoted the idea of Pan-Africanism as a solution, arguing that the Congolese people should see themselves not as Luba, Mongo, Congo, or any of the other 200 estimated ethnic groups in the country, but as Congolese and, above all, as Africans. And we can also look to the example of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, who espoused a similar ideology of pan-Arabism, which also sought to transcend the political divisions established under colonialism and promote a social and political union in the Arab world. The idea of pan-Arabism never took hold, largely as a result of disagreements between its two most outspoken proponents, Nasser in Egypt and Hafez al-Assad in Syria. Pan-Africanism fared a bit better, though its most vocal proponent, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated less than a year after taking office. Nevertheless, the idea of Pan-Africanism was integrated into the Organization of African Unity. Founded in 1963, the Organization for African Unity, or OAU, sought to promote the unity and solidarity of African states. But it also accepted the post-colonial boundaries as they existed. Indeed, it asserted that one of the other main goals was to defend the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of African states. So despite their artificial nature, ignoring geographic features, ethnic and cultural divisions, religious beliefs, local sensitivities, and historical realities, the boundaries largely remained in place. The decision to retain the artificial colonial borders was driven primarily by two forces. First, post-colonial leaders came to power in the context of the nation-state. Keeping the nation-state intact was thus central to keeping themselves in power. Second, and more pragmatically, even if there was general agreement on the need to redraw boundaries, it's not clear on what basis the new boundaries should be drawn. How small should the political unit be? Consider these two maps of Africa. The one on the left is the current political map. On the right is a map illustrating the numerous ethnic groups across the continent. Ethnic-based states would be too small to be stable. And therein lies the problem of nation building. Given the artificial nature of the post-colonial state and the fact that little can be done either practically or ideally about them, the fundamental challenge of the post-colonial state became constructing a common sense of belonging around which a new national identity could be formed. This lack of a common sense of identity is thus at the root of the problem of legitimacy faced by many developing countries. In many countries, the basis of legitimacy of the state is the belief that regardless of a political affiliation, ethnic identity, or other variable, the government is, at least ideally, supposed to make decisions for the benefit of the country as a whole rather than individual segments of society. But in many post-colonial states, that sense of legitimacy is underdeveloped, often facilitating a great deal of political instability. For if the state only rules on your behalf when your people control the state, then control of the state is absolutely critical. Before we come to that, though, let's briefly pause to consider the question of state building. Put simply, state building is the process of constructing the institutions of governance and administration, things like systems of governments, parliaments, bureaucracies, and so on, as well as the economic infrastructure needed for development. In Latin America, politics often took on a clientelist framework. Under clientelism, political parties distributed benefits, especially to the poor, in exchange for their electoral support. In Venezuela, for example, the government of Hugo Chavez undertook massive housing programs, building new apartments to house thousands of former shantytown dwellers. Such policies developed broad support for Chavez and his party among Venezuela's poor, but it also undermined the development of political institutions rooted in broader claims of equality, efficiency, or fairness. In Africa, a particular form of clientelism, usually referred to as neo-patrimonialism, emerged. In neo-patrimonial systems, formal political structures are supplanted by informal patron-client relationships, usually operating on the basis of ethnicity or village identity. Political leaders use their office to convey material benefits, roads, sewage, telephone access, and so on, to loyal clients. As with clientelism, such practices undermine the formal positions and bureaucratic structures of the state, replacing them with informal relations and networks of power more subject to change. Systems of personal relationships supplant the public, obedience is to the individual or to the party and not to the office or state. The contest for political office thus becomes a winner-take-all system in which the victor is able to distribute spoils to his or her supporters, while the loser and their supporters are excluded. The distribution of benefits under clientelism and neo-patrimonialism often facilitated rent-seeking behavior, corruption in everyday parlance. Now, before we get too excited about the problem of corruption in developing countries, it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. Rent-seeking is a technical term for any attempt to receive payment for or material benefits by manipulating the social political environment rather than by creating wealth. The most common form of this is bribery. It's important to remember that not all countries are equally subject to such practices, and there's considerable variation of corruption and rent-seeking between countries. Botswana, for example, undertook a massive campaign to stamp out corruption in the 1990s. The government established an anti-corruption commission, established codes of conduct for elected and appointed governmental officials, set up toll-free telephone lines and billboards advertising them to encourage people to report individuals who solicited bribes or engaged in other forms of corruption. It's also important to situate these practices in broader historical and international contexts. Until the passage of the Pendleton Act in 1883, most political offices in the United States were distributed according to the spoils system, which rewarded political supporters with government jobs. It took the assassination of President James Garfield in 1881 to spur changes to that system and to make most government positions in the U.S. merit-based. But even today, many U.S. ambassadors are political appointees who receive their ambassadorship as a reward for effective political fundraising. When Barack Obama was elected, 32 of the 58 ambassadorial appointments he made were to large campaign donors. And unless you think Obama was an anomaly, 15 of President George W. Bush's ambassadors were responsible for campaign donations of at least $100,000 each, and under President Trump, almost two-thirds of U.S. ambassadors were large political donors. The tradition of clientelism and rent-seeking, it seems, is alive and well in high levels of the U.S. Foreign Service. So that concludes our consideration of key elements of state building in the post-colonial era. Leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching, everyone. Have a good day.